5. Warnings. Banga won't work? Ichtak asked. What's wrong with Banga?
Never call a Lautani man proud, Setiawan laughed. Even if you mean it as a compliment. Pride is a great sin, even to the people who don't follow the feline faith of fire and sea. Just telling them to be proud won't play well. Maybe try using gung instead.
Ichtak furrowed his brow, the gray scar tissue where an eye had once been narrowing in undead sympathy with its living twin as he sighed. Gung means great, doesn't it? Won't that play just as badly?
No, Setiawan said with a wave of the hand, grinning. With a compliment there is plausible deniability. A Lautani man might do great things, but the job of mentioning them always belongs to other men. Then they can feel pride without ever saying out loud that they are proud.
Of course, Ichtak returned, sharing the grin. I'm glad to have you to lead me through the minefield. Ichtak turned to the mirror and righted the metal whose ribbon straddled his high collar, the gold and onyx Triskelion awarded for his final charge at Estlan taking pride of place whenever he had cause to don a uniform. But the modern uniform was paired with trappings that recalled a much earlier age in Sholoshaitan history. The broad sweep of the poncho-like shroud hanging from his shoulders gave him a sense of grandeur and height beyond his already imposing stature, but it was the feather-crested ceremonial helm he wore that truly made him a giant. When he placed it on his head and witnessed the impact it would make firsthand in the mirror, he almost felt at ease about giving a speech in a tongue that was not his own. But only almost. Any other pointers? Ichtak asked. His eye swept with practiced care down his chest and arms, making certain that every crease and contour in the garb of his country was not a hair out of line. When Setiawan had remained silent for several moments, Ichtak turned to face the room again, still fiddling with the helm, to find him standing mere inches away.
Yes, he said, tongue clicking off the back of his sharp teeth in mock irritation. Don't go out there with your collar looking like that.
The slight physician's apprentice reached up and fiddled with the onyx clasp just above his chest, making some adjustment Ichtak was blind to. The prince tensed, freezing with his arms in an awkward position above his shoulders, adjusting his helm while Setiawan did his work. It took only a few seconds, and for perhaps the 100th time that month, Ichtak felt certain on some elemental level that there had been nothing wrong. This, like the adjustment to his hilted maquahuit the week prior, or the Lautani's insistence on fixing up the shaving of the dark tuft upon his scalp in the style of Sholoshaitan soldiery the week before that, was theater. It was an excuse to be close to him, to be affectionate in a way that was formal, easily explicable. At least, the prince believed it was. It was also entirely possible Ichtak was misreading the acts, that he was, whether through selfish wishful indulgence or through the frightful need to avoid breaking with the advice he'd received in the tombs of Xolotlan, citing signals where there were none to be seen. Regardless, the risk of acting on that suspicion, whether that action was to spur the interactions on or drive them away, was irresponsible and, more importantly, reckless. So, once again, he stood in awkward silence, half-thrilled and half-frightened at something as simple as the brush of barely felt fingers through fabric, until Setiawan withdrew to nod his approval, grinning his infectious grin. Never a stitch out of place, Ichtak said, bringing gloved hands up to check the offending collar. You really should get a tailor attached to this tour, Setiawan scolded. Winning hearts and minds is much harder with an imperfect first impression. Ichtak gave a dismissive wave of the hand betrayed by the smile which followed. I'm the picture of perfection. His browless missing eye jolted to mimic a wink. Setiawan laughed. The noise never ceased to soothe Ichtak's moods, sweeping through the room like a warm breeze. The feline fell to contemplative silence before long, though, looking out the window and letting loose a distracted sigh.
You need to be careful out there, Setiawan said. There's danger around every corner for a prince in a newly integrated land. The Lautani who follow the codes of Harakwe are happy, but those who clung to the old ways will never be satisfied with things as they stand. Don't let your guard down.
Don't be too worried. I'm bulletproof after all.
I'm serious, Setiawan insisted. My family back in Adipelabuhan are constantly writing about this or that old friend or passing acquaintance of the clan who got snatched up by the Ektal for shadowy activity.
Setiawan was from a large and locally powerful clan, or Marga as the Lautani called them, in the prosperous little fishing town just north of Estlan from which he hailed. It was seldom he talked about them, but he was always posting letters to them with the mail service as their little retinue traveled the peninsula.
My sister seems to think there's a lot of resistance here, the feline explained. She's told me to keep safe if I go near the temple. You're going to the temple, so I'm telling you to be safe.
He was close, having advanced again as if to adjust Ichtak's metals. Ichtak met Setiawan's eyes, and thoughts jumbled as he tried to think of something to say. He had to fill the desperately close, empty air. Ruhualpa is always 3 steps ahead in any scenario, no matter how dangerous, Ichtak said. He'll have the venue locked down. I trust him.
I should hope so, my lord,
came a familiar, rasped tone. Ruhualpa rounded the corner in pursuit of the words.
We have several hundred natives ready to hear you speak.
Setiawan stepped back out of the intervening space as the Kandari entered the prince's room, the move a bit hastier than even deference towards the reputation of the marshal would entail. Ichtak stepped forward, placing himself between the physician's apprentice and his old friend. And I'm ready to win them over, Ichtak told him, tapping the bunched notes in his pocket for emphasis. Point me to the temple and I'll shake it to its core. Setiawan smirked despite his nerves, as did Ruhualpa, easing the tension a little. The marshal turned his snout towards the Lautani, putting on as easy a tone as his scarred muzzle allowed and saying, Go and join your master. He'll be looking for you. The medical staff is to be on standby, as always.
Of course, sir, Setiawan said with a bow of the head, clicking his feet to attention before striding out of the room, eyes glued to the floor beneath him as he went. He had a staid, quiet timidity around most people that intrigued Ichtak. Are you worried I'll botch the speech? Ichtak hoped the question would divert any comments about Setiawan's presence. It didn't. You shouldn't keep bringing him in here like this, Ruhualpa said, only waiting long enough for the apprentice's footfalls to dissipate. His voice was caring, not threatening, providing advice rather than rebuke. It won't end well for either of you.
It isn't like that, Ichtak said.
Your mother is brutal, but there is deep wisdom behind her worries, the marshal pressed on, not heeding the words. The public needs a reflection, a noble representative of the man in the street to rule them. No matter your valor, there are certain things that would be better kept subdued, lest the word escape to the wider world.
It isn't like that, Ichtak repeated, more emphatic. Those days are over.
I trust that's true for now, said Ruhualpa, but the presence of temptation can break the best of men, whatever the vice.
I have a duty to too many people for temptation to hold any power over me.
Good, the marshal said, clapping Ichtak on the shoulder. There's few things more vital in a man who will wield total authority. But why keep him here at all, then?
I can have friends, Ruhualpa, Ichtak said.
You have friends, Ruhualpa countered. Fine friends. Tishak and all your friends from your years in the Kalmakak. Akoat, the priest you dine with in Tepeklan. I'd like to count myself among them.
I need conversation, and not every conversation can be about war or duty or life and death. I enjoy his sense of humor. Ruhualpa sighed, looking Ichtak over carefully, the cunning in his predator's eyes softened by affection. The silence was long and awkward. "I mean no threat," he said. "My side is yours, I believe you. But as you have been told so often, you are not your own man. You are not a laborer plucked from the streets of Tepeclan, free to pursue whatever makes you happy when the day's shifts in. You are to be Tlatoani, and as such your life and your happiness is not your own. Even though I believe what you say, there are those who would not, those who would be fast to speculate and speak aloud such speculation. It is them that worry me." "There's no way to know if he even shares my defects," Ichtak continued, his voice catching on the last word. "There's no way of knowing if anyone does. Not without putting my duty to the Empire and all those who've come before me in doubt. Not without putting them in danger." Ichtak shook his head, dismissing the topic, saying, "My interests are one with yours. You needn't fret about me or him." Ruhualpa nodded, clearing his throat in a harsh and hacking gesture perhaps meant to clear the air of the excruciating, awkward exchange. He then motioned for the prince to follow as he made for the door. "Come on, my boy. The people of Xochotlan are waiting." Xochotlan, once named Jakasar, was yet another of the Lautani holdfasts on the continent which had been seized by Xolushaidi during the last Laut Xolushaitian War. Its people, like most of the hardy continental Lautani, had long been adherents of Harakwe's faith, exported to them by Xolushaitian tradesmen and philosophers in days now buried by the ages. This had stoked beliefs in Tepeclan that their souls would make welcome additions to the dominion of Xolushaidi. This had, in other areas, not proven true. In the north of the empire, where the wandering Xolushaitian settlers of the Kushkot Mountains had dwelt in days before the region's incorporation into the empire, the shared faith and kindred of the canines had done little to curb centuries of attempted secession and reform. As Ruhualpa was fond of telling the young Ichtak during childhood trips into Kushkotlan province for royal schmoozing, the difference between the Xolushaitians of the Central Highlands and those of the Northern Mountains could be, at length, boiled down to 200 words. Their dialects, otherwise indistinguishable, held just 200 distinct pronunciations. This had been enough to drive the poetic, literary, and cultural wedge of differentiation between them, and to spill the blood of millions over several decades-long struggles for separation, only ended in relative modernity by the intermarrying of a great many noble families from both factions. In the south, though, one force was serving to prevent an even more alien group of felines, with its own language and hybridized mythology, from feeling that same dangerous isolation from power. Eztlan's revolt, no matter how many of its underpinnings could be placed on the shoulders of subversive agents of the Lautani Duumvirate from abroad, had served to remind the Xolushaitian crown of its tentative hold on the feline-populated southern peninsula. When grasping for methods to plant the faithful of the Eztlan province more firmly under the Xolushaitian banner, Ruhualpa had been fond of a draconian plan forwarded by several Ektal noteworthies, which favored decimation of certain fighting-age male populations among the felines still following their own ethnic religion on the peninsula, along with an upscaling of martial presence in the province. Tlatoani Izel, along with the local Eztlanishko dynasty newly crowned to govern the province from the capital in Eztlan, the first kingly house in the empire raised from folk of the Lautani kindred, had proposed a different tactic, and despite the worries of those in the legions, it seemed to be bearing fruit. The Tlatoani had insisted that Ichtak was the key to this peacetime crisis, petitioning his use as a game piece in winning over public opinion among the loyalist Lautani subjects in the south, while simultaneously holding firm the support of the hardliners in Xolushaiti's heartland. The crown would give concessions to the newly minted Lautani residents of the empire, issue funds for the repair or improvement of infrastructure damaged in the uprisings, and broaden the capacity of the felines to serve in the imperial legions, thus giving them a route to earn brands of bloodletting and, by extension, full citizenship. Hardliners, seeing this, would have their protests cut short if it were Ichtak, the conquering hero of Estlan, purveyor of the first sacrifice atop Shahuitzul in over a decade, who toured the lands of these future subjects making the proclamations. While initially skeptical himself, Ichtak had found over the past few months visiting the region that his bombastic and talkative nature was well suited to the task, growing into the role and researching its every facet like a driven scholar chasing down sources. He had learned much of the local history of the Lautani Duumvirit's reign on the peninsula, and had learned some of the intricacies of Harakwe's worship in the region, where it had adopted syncretic customs and idioms from the volcanic Lautani faith which preceded it. Ichtak could speak to the old oppressions thrust upon these heretics to the seafaring faith by the theocracy which ruled the Duumvirit, and thus bond them more closely with their kindred worshippers in the Sholoshaishan heartland. More impactful than any of these efforts, though, was his capacity for Lautani speech. Not only had Ichtak been fast to master the flowing Lautani language's continental dialect, but he had mastered it in the accents of the middle classes outside the Duumvirit's heartland in the Lautan archipelago. Here was a canine representative of the first noble house of Sholoshaidi, speaking to the masses of the once Duumvirit-ruled countryside in their own vernacular, joking and bantering with crowds small and large in ways the old clergy of the Isles never could. Not too crass or uncultured for the upper crust of Lautani society, but also not so polished and pretentious that he alienated the dockworkers and fisherfolk of the poorer districts. He urged replacement of the local, more literary school system of Lautani custom with the harsh Sholoshaishan martial academies of the broader empire, while simultaneously easing some of their fears about planned reformation of local beliefs to match the imperial orthodoxy. No one save Ichtak knew how much Setiawan's counsel had to do with this success. It was something which often troubled him, making him wish there was some way he could publicly acknowledge the aid without breeding suspicious whispers and speculation among his own retinue. He could think of none, the specter of Shatal's end looming over his musings on the matter. As he wrapped up his address in a beautiful old canopied courtyard in a Harakwe-devoted temple constructed in the peak-roofed Lautani style, and the applause of his 200 or so local feline onlookers died down, the prince made a mental note to drop by the apprentice's chamber that evening to let him know how it had gone. Even if he could not tell him in person, he could leave a note to let him know the advice on pride had been well given. The prince turned after a grateful bow, pushed through the doorway into the clergy chambers behind the podium, and was nearly bowled over by a flustered Ruhualpa and his retinue of Ektal bodyguards. So sudden was the encounter that Ichtak nearly had the Makwahwit at his belt in hand before the High Marshal's voice brought him to full awareness of the situation. "There's been an incident," Ruhualpa explained, eyes darting for the doorway through which Ichtak had come. "And?" "An old revolver was found on a visitor to the temple who pushed in late, after the speech had begun," Ruhualpa explained. "The local priests caught word of it before anything could be done. We've got the man in binds now, but the Ektal interrogators will need time to pull information out of him. I'd suggest we get you off the temple grounds, in case he had friends we don't know about." Ichtak scanned the darkened corridors of the temple around them, letting the words sink in as he was ushered through the rearmost doors of the complex and into an unmarked Ektal armored car. It was the priests who knew? "Yes," Ruhualpa answered, piling in behind him and motioning for the driver to move. "I'm having Ektal follow up with them now, to see what channels they got wind of it through." Setiawan was right to worry, I suppose, Ichtak mused internally, shaking his head. He didn't dare share such thoughts with Ruhalpa, not with the High Marshal's suspicious nature being what it was. He did not need Ruhalpa running down the timid physician's apprentice for leads. "We'll have to invite the priests to dinner tonight, then," Ichtak said. "I wouldn't want them thinking they've done something wrong by helping us." "Indeed," Ruhalpa agreed. "Keeping men of the cloth in your corner is a wise move." Ichtak stayed silent, letting the florid greens of Estlan province do what they could to ease his racing mind as he rode, all the while trying not to consider how close to an ignominious doom away from the battlefield he might have come.